The morning sun crested over the eastern ridge, painting my 10 acres in golden light. I stood on my back porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the mist lift slowly from the pasture. This land represented 15 years of saving, planning, and dreaming. Every inch of it belonged to me, free and clear of any mortgage or debt. The oak trees that dotted the property had been here for generations, silent witnesses to the changing landscape. I purchased this slice of rural paradise specifically for its isolation and privacy. The nearest neighbor, Harold, lived a quarter-mile down the gravel road, an elderly man who valued solitude as much as I did. We respected each other's boundaries with a friendly wave when our paths crossed, but mostly left each other in peace. That mutual understanding of personal space was precisely why I chose country living over suburban neighborhoods with their manicured lawns and prying eyes. My morning ritual included checking on Diego, Sancho, and Panza, the 3 guard llamas that patrolled my property. Most people found it amusing that I kept llamas instead of dogs, but they did not understand their effectiveness. These creatures were naturally territorial and surprisingly intelligent. They kept coyotes away from my small flock of chickens better than any dog could, and they required minimal care beyond good pasture and occasional medical attention. I approached the fence where Diego stood at attention, his large ears swiveling to track sounds across the property. His thick wool coat gleamed in the morning light as I scratched between his ears. "Everything quiet out here, buddy?" I asked, receiving a gentle hum in response. The llamas represented the perfect balance of security and companionship for my lifestyle. Behind my modest farmhouse stood the structure that had become both my hobby space and sanctuary. The gun shed, as I called it, housed my collection of historical firearms. Each piece represented American craftsmanship and engineering across different eras. Some were family heirlooms passed down through generations, others carefully acquired at auctions and from private collectors. All were legally owned, properly secured, and meticulously maintained. The shed itself was purpose-built with reinforced doors, proper ventilation, temperature control, and a state-of-the-art security system. I had gone above and beyond legal requirements because responsible ownership meant everything to me. This was not just a collection, but a connection to history and tradition that I deeply valued. The tranquility of my rural existence had remained undisturbed until 3 months ago, when bulldozers appeared beyond my eastern fence line. The forest buffer that once separated my property from the county road was quickly transformed into a construction site. Signs announced the future home of Whispering Pines Estates, promising luxury living with convenient access to country charm. I accepted the inevitability of development with reluctant resignation. The county had been growing for years, and it was only a matter of time before suburbia crept closer to my doorstep. What I had not anticipated was how quickly that development would attempt to impose its values on surrounding properties. The first sign of trouble arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. I retrieved a cream-colored envelope from my mailbox, the paper thick and expensive with gold embossing across the top that read Valley View Homeowners Association. Inside was a formal notice about unauthorized structures on my property that failed to meet community guidelines. I laughed out loud standing in my gravel driveway. My property predated their development by decades. I had signed no contracts, agreed to no terms, and certainly had not consented to any oversight from people who had just arrived. I tossed the letter into my recycling bin without a second thought. This was clearly a mistake that would resolve itself once they consulted property maps. That evening, as I watched the sunset from my front porch rocker, a black luxury SUV drove slowly past my property, brake lights flashing briefly as it passed my driveway. The vehicle continued down the road before turning around and passing again, this time with passenger windows lowered. I felt eyes examining my property, cataloging details, making judgments. Something in my gut tightened with unease. The casual dismissal I had felt toward the HOA letter transformed into a prickle of concern that worked its way up my spine. The county record's office smelled of dust and forgotten paperwork. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as the clerk retrieved my property documents from metal filing cabinets along the back wall. I had decided to verify my property boundaries and zoning status after receiving 2 additional notices from the Valley View HOA, each more strongly worded than the last. The clerk, a woman with gray hair and bifocals hanging from a beaded chain around her neck, spread the survey maps across the counter. "Your property is right here," she said, finger tracing the boundaries of my 10 acres. This was all part of the old Wilson farm until it was subdivided in the 1970s. Your deed clearly shows you are outside any current HOA jurisdiction. I nodded, taking photos of the documents with my phone, and there is no way they can claim authority over my property, even though they are adjacent. The clerk shook her head. "Not unless you sign something giving them that right. Have you signed anything recently?" "Absolutely not," I replied emphatically. She gathered the papers together, returning them to their folder. "Then, legally speaking, they have no authority over your property, but just between us," she lowered her voice, leaning closer, "these new developments have friends in the zoning office. They sometimes find creative interpretations of county ordinances to get their way." I thanked her and left with copies of all relevant documents. The knowledge reinforced my position, but did little to ease my growing concern. My instincts told me this situation would not resolve itself with a simple presentation of facts. 3 days later, the crunch of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Through my kitchen window, I watched a silver Mercedes SUV park in my driveway. A woman emerged, her designer boots and tailored pantsuit wildly out of place against the backdrop of my modest farmhouse and surrounding pasture. I stepped onto my porch as she approached, her smile fixed and professional. "Good morning. I am Meredith Harrington, president of the Valley View Homeowners Association. I thought it might be nice to discuss our community standards in person rather than through more formal channels." "There is nothing to discuss," I replied calmly. "My property is not part of your association or development. I have verified this with county records." Her smile remained unchanged, but something hardened in her eyes. "Perhaps I can come in. This conversation might be more comfortable inside." Against my better judgment, I allowed her into my living room, where she immediately opened a leather portfolio filled with glossy photographs and documents. "Our development represents a significant investment for all homeowners," she began, her voice practiced and smooth. "Property values depend on consistent aesthetic standards throughout the viewshed." "The viewshed," I interrupted. "Yes, properties visible from our community affect our property values. Your rustic structures and agricultural activities present challenges to our marketing efforts." She pointed to a complicated zoning map. "There is a county ordinance about properties adjacent to planned developments. Section 12.3 allows for reasonable aesthetic consistency requirements." I leaned forward, examining the document. "That ordinance applies to new construction permits, not existing structures. My property predates your development by decades." Meredith's perfect smile faltered momentarily. "Our attorneys have a different interpretation. We would hate to involve them, but the board is prepared to take all necessary actions to protect our community investment." The implied threat hung in the air between us. I stood up, signaling the end of our conversation. "I appreciate your visit, Ms. Harrington, but I will not be altering my property to satisfy your aesthetic preferences. My land, my rules." As I walked her to the door, her gaze fell on the gun shed visible beyond my back porch. She stopped abruptly. "Is that a weapons storage facility?" "That is my private hobby shop," I replied carefully, "all legally permitted and properly secured." Something changed in her expression then, a calculating look replacing the practiced civility. She said nothing more as she returned to her vehicle, but I knew this encounter had escalated matters beyond a simple boundary dispute. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived describing my dangerous weapons cache as a direct threat to community safety and demanding immediate inspection by their private security consultant. The letter referenced county ordinances about hazardous materials storage and included veiled threats about reporting concerns to federal authorities. Standing in my kitchen, letter in hand, I understood that this was never about property lines or aesthetic standards. Meredith Harrington had found what she believed was leverage, and she intended to use it. The battle for my property had begun in earnest. The security cameras arrived in discreet brown boxes the following morning. I had ordered a comprehensive system after realizing this conflict would not resolve through reasonable discussion. 6 weatherproof cameras with night vision capability, motion detection, and cloud storage would ensure no activity around my property went undocumented. While unpacking the equipment at my kitchen table, a knock at the door revealed Harold, my elderly neighbor, leaning on. His walking stick saw the delivery truck, he said, nodding toward the boxes. Finally getting some proper security, are you? I invited him in, pouring him coffee as I explained my situation with the HOA. Harold listened intently, nodding occasionally, his weathered face growing increasingly concerned. Those HOA vultures tried the same approach with my tractor collection last year, he revealed, passing me a screwdriver as we began installing the first camera above my front porch. Claimed my industrial equipment violated some ordinance or another. They do not take rejection well. Harold helped me position cameras strategically around the property perimeter, focusing particularly on the areas visible from the main road and the eastern boundary adjacent to the new development. His insight proved invaluable, his experience with rural properties helping identify the most vulnerable access points. The thing about these fancy development folks, Harold continued as we worked, is they think money equals authority. They move out here from the city for the country lifestyle but want to bring their city rules with them. He secured a wire with electrical tape. Just wait until they hear your target practice. I had not mentioned my regular shooting sessions in my secure back field, but Harold had obviously heard them over the years and never complained. Like many rural residents, he understood responsible firearm ownership was part of country living. The footage captured the very next day confirmed my suspicions. My phone alerted me to motion detection at the eastern property line around midday. The video showed 2 elegantly dressed women and a man in golf attire walking slowly along my fence, stopping occasionally to point at various structures on my property. One held a clipboard making notes, while another took photographs with a professional camera equipped with a telephoto lens. I forwarded the footage to my friend Mark, an attorney specializing in property law. His response arrived that evening in the form of a formal letter confirming what I already knew. My property remained sovereign from HOA jurisdiction, and their persistent attempts to impose their will constituted potential harassment. 3 days later, a patrol car pulled into my driveway. Deputy Reynolds, a young officer I recognized from community meetings, approached with visible discomfort. "Good afternoon," he began awkwardly. "We received an anonymous complaint about an unauthorized weapons stockpile on this property. Department policy requires me to follow up on such reports." I invited him to inspect my gun shed, providing documentation for each firearm in my collection. Deputy Reynolds conducted a thorough but respectful examination, clearly embarrassed by the situation. "Everything here is perfectly legal and properly secured," he concluded, completing his report on a department tablet. "Better secured than most collections I have seen, actually." As he prepared to leave, Deputy Reynolds hesitated by his vehicle. "Watch yourself with that HOA crowd," he said quietly, glancing around as if concerned about being overheard. "Some folks in this county think rules apply differently to them. Sheriff Johnson has noticed how they leverage connections at the courthouse." I thanked him for the warning, watching his patrol car disappear down my driveway. The escalation was concerning but not unexpected. What troubled me more was how quickly they had managed to initiate an official inspection. It suggested connections within local government that could prove challenging to overcome. That evening, as darkness settled over the property, my landline telephone rang. Few people had this number, making the call immediately suspicious. "Those llamas of yours look dangerous," said an unfamiliar voice, the connection slightly muffled as if the caller was disguising their voice. "Sure would be a shame if someone left your gate open while you were away. Coyotes have been bad this season." The line went dead before I could respond. I immediately checked my security cameras, confirming all gates remained secure. The llamas were gathered near the barn, their silhouettes visible in the security lighting. Diego stood alert, ears forward, sensing something that had disturbed his usually calm demeanor. I moved my shotgun from the gun shed to a secure but accessible location inside my home that night. The threat, thinly veiled as it was, crossed a line from harassment to potential criminal action. My property was no longer merely being observed, it was being targeted. The next morning, I installed additional lighting around the llama enclosure and added a heavy-duty padlock to their gate. As I worked, Diego approached the fence, his large brown eyes watching me intently. I reached out to scratch his neck, receiving a gentle hum of approval in response. "We are going to need to watch out for each other," I told him quietly. "They are not playin' G by any rules now." Diego turned his gaze toward the eastern property line, ears swiveling to track a sound I could not hear. In that moment, I felt oddly reassured. The llamas had their own way of maintaining vigilance, and they took their protective roles seriously. What the HOA saw as livestock, I knew to be loyal guardians with surprising intelligence and remarkable territorial instincts. The community center buzzed with whispered conversations as I entered the monthly HOA meeting. Despite not being a member, I had decided to attend as a concerned adjacent property owner, hoping rational discussion might still be possible. I carried a folder containing county maps, property records, and my attorney's written opinion regarding jurisdictional boundaries. The room fell silent as heads turned in my direction. I recognized several faces from my security footage, their expressions ranging from surprise to thinly veiled hostility. I took a seat in the back row, nodding politely to those who made eye contact. Meredith Harrington stood at the podium, her presentation about community landscaping requirements interrupted by my arrival. She recovered quickly, finishing her point before transitioning to new business. The casual way she glanced in my direction made it clear my presence had been anticipated. "Before we continue," she announced, "I should address the elephant in the room. Many of you have expressed concerns about the property adjacent to our eastern boundary." I raised my hand, intending to request speaking time during the appropriate segment, following proper meeting protocol. Meredith acknowledged me with a tight smile. "I believe our neighbor wishes to address the community," she said, gesturing toward me. "Perhaps you would like to explain your position on community safety standards." I stood, folder in hand. "Thank you for allowing me to speak. I have brought documentation confirming that my property is outside HOA jurisdiction. I am happy to discuss any legitimate concerns neighbors might have, but wanted to clarify the legal boundaries first." Before I could open my folder, Meredith interrupted. "What our neighbor fails to mention is the arsenal being maintained within sight of our children's playground." Her voice carried through the room as she stood straighter, pointing dramatically in my direction. "We have a malicious sympathizer stockpiling weapons within sight of our children." Gasps erupted from the audience. Several parents pulled out phones, taking pictures of me as if documenting a threat. My attempts to respond were repeatedly interrupted by audience members now calling out questions about assault weapons and explosive materials, terms that had never been used in any legitimate inspection of my property. "This is completely false," I stated firmly when I could finally be heard. "I collect historical firearms, all legally owned and properly secured. There has been an official inspection by the Sheriff's Department that confirmed everything is in compliance with county regulations." A security guard appeared at my side, a man in a polo shirt with a private security company logo. "Sir, we are going to have to ask you to leave. We cannot have disruptions during official meetings." "This is a public meeting in a community center," I protested. "I have every right to attend and respond to accusations." "This is a private HOA meeting in a facility we have rented," Meredith corrected, her smile returning. "For members only. Our security will escort you out." I gathered my documents, maintaining my composure despite the growing frustration. "Everything I own is legal, properly stored, and on private property outside your jurisdiction," I stated clearly before leaving. "Any claims to the contrary are defamation." 3 days later, the county newspaper featured a front-page article titled "Rural Holdout Causes Concern for Upscale Development." The story presented a heavily slanted narrative, quoting community leaders about safety concerns while only briefly mentioning that no violations had been found during official inspections. The reporter had never contacted me for comment. The photo accompanying the article showed my property from a distance, the angle carefully chosen to make my modest farmhouse appear dilapidated and my gun shed ominously isolated. A smaller photo showed children playing in the development's new playground, positioned directly beneath the main image in a clear attempt to create visual contrast between threat and innocence. More troubling than the biased reporting was what I discovered that afternoon while searching real estate listings online. My property appeared on multiple websites as a distressed opportunity with motivated seller status. According to these listings, my land was primed for development and ready to incorporate into existing planned community. I had never listed my property for sale, had not authorized any broker to represent me, and certainly was not a motivated seller. Someone was deliberately creating the impression that my property would soon be available, presumably at below market value due to some financial or legal distress. The building inspector who arrived unannounced the following morning provided the missing piece of the puzzle. A middle-aged man with practical work boots and a clipboard, he seemed genuinely uncomfortable with his assignment. "Got a complaint about non-permitted structures," he explained, showing me a form with an anonymous submission. "Have to follow up on all reports." I accompanied him around the property, showing permits for every structure including the gun shed. He confirmed that everything was properly documented and built to code, making notes in his tablet as we walked. As he prepared to leave, he hesitated by his truck. "Listen," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure we were alone. "Someone downtown really wants you gone. This is the third complaint about your property this month, all from different sources but with identical wording. Never seen anything like it." "Who is filing these complaints?" I asked. He shook his head. "Cannot say officially, but there is only one development company that has its own office in the county building. They bring donuts to all the staff meetings." He handed me his card with a personal cell phone number written on the back. "Call me directly if more inspectors show up. Something is not right about how this is being handled." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by newspapers, inspection reports, security footage, and anonymous complaint forms. The pattern became undeniable. This was not about safety concerns or aesthetic standards. This was a coordinated campaign to pressure me into selling my property, using my gun collection as convenient justification to paint me as a threat to the community. The HOA had found their villain, and I had been cast in the role without consent. My constitutional right to bear arms was being weaponized against me in the court of public opinion. The legal ownership of firearms, stored securely on private property, had been transformed into stockpiling weapons through nothing more than repetition of the claim. Looking out my window at the darkening sky, I watched Diego patrolling the fence line, his silhouette alert and vigilant. The irony was not lost on me that my actual security system consisted not of my gun collection, but of 3 llamas with a strong sense of territory and remarkable intuition about threats. They had detected the change in our peaceful existence long before the inspectors and complaint forms began arriving. I reached for my phone and scrolled to a new contact. It was time to speak directly with Sheriff Johnson himself, not just his deputies. This situation had moved beyond zoning disputes and into potential criminal misrepresentation. I needed someone with authority who could recognize the pattern of harassment for what it was. Sheriff Johnson removed his hat as he settled into my kitchen chair 3 days later. Steam rose from the coffee mug between us as he reviewed the folder of documentation I had compiled. His weathered face showed both concern and frustration as he flipped through security footage stills, newspaper clippings, and copies of the fraudulent real estate listings. "Been sheriff in this county for 18 years, he said finally, closing the folder. "Started seeing this pattern about 5 years ago when the big developments began moving in from the city. They find isolated properties, create problems for the owners, then swoop in to solve those problems by purchasing the land." I nodded, having suspected as much, but using county resources to do it seems illegal. It skirts the line, Sheriff Johnson agreed, tapping the folder with a calloused finger. Between us, the HOA crowd has been pushing their boundaries all over the county, but they usually stay within technical legality, make life difficult enough that selling becomes the path of least resistance. He explained how Meredith's husband, Richard Harrington, held a position on the county zoning board, creating convenient regulatory blind spots and fast-tracking approvals for their development while scrutinizing surrounding properties with unprecedented rigor. That explains the building inspector visits, I noted, and the deputy being sent to check my gun collection. Sheriff Johnson nodded grimly. Deputy Reynolds told me about that inspection, said your storage was better than the department's own armory. That report should have ended the matter, but someone keeps pushing it. What can be done? I asked, refilling his coffee cup. Legally, he shrugged. Document everything, record every interaction, note times, dates, and names. If they cross the line into criminal harassment or trespassing, call me immediately. He handed me his direct number. And keep those llamas secu. Red, they are looking for any violation they can use against you. After the sheriff departed, I implemented his advice immediately, creating a detailed log of all past incidents and establishing protocols for documenting future interactions. I installed additional memory cards in the security cameras and set up automated backup to secure cloud storage. The HOA surveillance became predictable over the following weeks, a rotation of luxury vehicles slowly passing my property at specific times each day. My security cameras captured everything: the drivers, passengers, license plates, and the deliberate way they photographed different aspects of my property. What concerned me more was the effect this regular intrusion had on my llamas. Diego, Sancho, and Panza, normally peaceful creatures, began standing alert near the fence during these drive-bys, ears forward, protective instincts engaged. Diego, the largest male, would pace the fence line, watching the vehicles with unusual intensity. Llamas are naturally territorial animals with strong protective instincts toward their herd and property. While generally docile, they can become defensive when they perceive threats, especially repeated intrusions into their territory. The daily parade of unfamiliar vehicles was triggering their guardian behaviors in progressively stronger ways. One afternoon, a white luxury sedan paused longer than usual near the eastern fence line. Diego approached the fence, standing tall with his ears flattened back, a warning posture I recognized from his interactions with coyotes. The car lingered another moment before accelerating away, but the pattern had been established. My llamas now viewed these vehicles as potential threats. I contacted a local livestock veterinarian for advice about the situation, concerned about the stress these daily intrusions might be causing the animals. Dr. Wilson visited the property, examining the llamas and observing their behavior. They are not showing signs of harmful stress, she assured me after her examination. Actually, they are displaying textbook protective behaviors. Llamas have been used as guard animals for centuries for good reason. They bond with their territory and will defend it against what they perceive as predators. Should I be concerned about their aggressive posturing? I asked. Not unless someone enters their enclosure uninvited, she replied. Llamas rarely attack without significant provocation, but they will absolutely chase intruders off their territory. That is literally their job as guard animals. Her assessment reassured me about the llama's well-being, but raised concerns about the escalating situation. If the HOA members continued their surveillance tactics, the animals would continue viewing them as threats. Any direct interaction could potentially trigger protective behaviors. The following week, Harold called early one morning, his voice urgent. "Overheard something at the diner you should know about," he said without preamble. "They are planning some kind of inspection of your property while you are away at that gun collectors conference in Springfield next weekend." "How would they know about that?" I asked, alarmed. The conference was not widely advertised and I had only mentioned it to a few fellow collectors. "Small town," Harold replied grimly. "Somebody always knows somebody who talks too much. Point is, they think you will be gone Friday through Sunday. Heard them planning to bring in some private inspector to check your compliance while you are away. I thanked Harold for the warning, immediately realizing the opportunity this information presented. If they were planning to enter my property during my absence, they would be committing clear trespassing, possibly breaking and entering if they attempted to access any structures. That evening, I called Sheriff Johnson to inform him of what I had learned. "Do not confront them yourself," he warned. "That could escalate dangerously. Document everything and call me immediately if they enter your property." "I have a better idea," I replied, explaining my plan to appear absent while actually remaining on the property to document their trespassing firsthand. Sheriff Johnson hesitated before responding. "That could work, but be careful. These people are not used to being caught in the act. Have your phone ready to call for backup if needed." I spent the next few days preparing, rescheduling my conference attendance, and creating the appearance that I would be away as expected. I informed Harold of my plan, arranging for access through his connecting field so I could return to my property unobserved after ostentatiously departing. By Thursday evening, everything was in place. The security cameras were positioned optimally, extra memory cards installed, and remote monitoring set up on my phone. The llamas had been fed and secured in their enclosure with access to the main pasture, the Ranch Secu. RIDI system was tested and operational, including the alarm that I normally used to recall the llamas during storms. As I prepared for bed that night, I watched Diego standing at attention near the fence line, his silhouette visible in the security lighting. Something in his posture, alert, vigilant, protective, reminded me that I was not alone in defending my property. My guardians with the long necks and keen senses had their own stake in this confrontation. My truck pulled away from the property at exactly 9:00 a.m. on Friday, visible to anyone watching from the road. I drove slowly, overnight bag visible on the passenger seat, creating the perfect picture of someone leaving for a weekend trip. Instead of continuing to the highway, however, I followed a prearranged route through backcountry roads, eventually arriving at Harold's property. "They have been driving past 3 times already this morning," Harold reported as he helped me navigate through his back field. "Checking to make sure you left, I reckon." I thanked him and continued on foot through the connecting pasture, careful to remain out of sight from the main road. Once back on my own property, I entered through the rear door and settled in my darkened living room with clear views of both my security monitor screens and the approach to my house. The hours passed slowly. I maintained complete silence, keeping away from windows and using my phone to monitor the security camera feeds. The llamas grazed peacefully in their enclosure, occasionally glancing toward the eastern fence line as if expecting something. At exactly 10:40 a.m., my phone vibrated with motion alerts from the front entrance cameras. 3 vehicles approached in procession, a familiar silver Mercedes SUV leading, followed by a white maintenance van and a black luxury sedan. They parked near my front gate rather than in the driveway, a clear attempt at maintaining deniability if spotted. 5 people emerged from the vehicles. Meredith Harrington led the group, clipboard in hand, dressed in what appeared to be a carefully calculated approximation of country casual attire that still probably cost more than most rural residents' monthly mortgage payments. 2 board members I recognized from the HOA meeting followed, along with a man carrying locksmith tools and another with official-looking documents and measuring equipment. They moved with entitled confidence across my property, speaking in normal tones as if conducting authorized business. My security cameras captured their conversation with perfect clarity. "Remember, we are just doing a standard compliance inspection," Meredith instructed the group. "If anyone questions our presence, we have concerns about code violations visible from the road." "What about the locks?" asked the man with the tools. "Those clearly violate emergency access regulations," she replied smoothly. "We are merely ensuring proper authorities could enter if necessary." They proceeded directly toward the gun shed, ignoring the main house entirely. Their purposeful movement made it clear this was a targeted operation focused specifically on gaining access to my secured collection. When they reached the shed and the locksmith knelt before the door, examining the heavy-duty padlock and security features, I made my decision. I had enough video evidence of trespassing already. It was time to end this before they damaged my property. I pressed the ranch alarm button mounted near my back door. The piercing wail shattered the morning quiet, causing birds to scatter from nearby trees. On my security monitor, I watched the trespassers freeze in momentary confusion before scattering in different directions. What happened next was entirely predictable to anyone familiar with livestock training, but clearly came as a shock to the intruders. The alarm served a dual purpose on my property, warning of intrusion, but also signaling the llamas to return to the barn during severe weather. I had conditioned them to associate that specific sound with moving quickly toward the source, not away from it. Diego led the charge, followed closely by Sancho and Panza, 300 pounds of protective camelid muscle each, galloping toward the intruders with surprising speed. Their ears were pinned back, necks extended forward in full territorial defense posture. The intruders, now in complete disarray, ran frantically toward their vehicles. Meredith kicked off her impractical footwear, sprinting barefoot across the pasture with Diego closing the distance behind her. The locksmith dropped his tools, scrambling under the fence while Sancho diverted to cut off the board members rushing toward the driveway. By magnificent coincidence or perfect timing, Sheriff Johnson's Jeep pulled up my drive at that exact moment. He had agreed to stop by around 11 to check on my property, ensuring everything remained secure during my supposed absence. Instead, he arrived to witness me. Dith and her committee fleeing across my front pasture, pursued by highly motivated llamas protecting their territory. The security footage captured everything with perfect clarity: the trespassing, the locksmith attempting to breach my shed, and finally, all three committee members climbing frantically into the sheriff's vehicle, begging for protection from what Meredith hysterically described as my attack animals. From my living room window, I watched as Sheriff Johnson calmly exited his vehicle, hands raised toward the llamas who immediately recognized him as a regular, authorized visitor. Diego and his companions stopped their pursuit, standing at attention several yards away, maintaining their guard position now that the intruders were contained. I waited a few minutes longer before emerging from my house, walking casually toward the sheriff's vehicle as if just discovering the commotion. The expressions on the trespassers' faces as they realized I had never left my property would remain among my most satisfying memories for years to come. The courtroom fell silent as my security footage played on the large screen. The county judge, Honorable Elena Martinez, watched with intense focus as the video showed Meredith Harrington and her committee trespassing on my property and attempting to access my secured gun shed. The locksmith's tools were clearly visible as he knelt before the door, and the audio captured Meredith's instructions about emergency access regulations with perfect clarity. Meredith's attorney slumped visibly in his chair when the locksmith appeared on screen, tools in hand. There was no plausible explanation for bringing a locksmith to a supposed visual inspection, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. Judge Martinez, a lifelong county resident known for her no-nonsense approach to property rights, removed her glasses slowly when the footage concluded. The court finds clear evidence of criminal trespassing, attempted breaking and entering, and conspiracy to violate property rights, she announced. This was not a misunderstanding or overreach of authority. This was a deliberate attempt to gain unauthorized access to a secure structure on private property. The resulting legal consequences extended far beyond the restraining orders I had initially requested. Criminal charges were filed against Meredith Harrington and the locksmith for attempted breaking and entering. The two board members received misdemeanor trespassing charges. The fraudulent real estate listings triggered an investigation by the state licensing board. Perhaps most significantly, the county launched a formal investigation into zoning board practices after Sheriff Johnson submitted evidence.